Good one. Um, I'm just going to do a little housekeeping and then the real people are going to come out. My name is Cleve Corner. I'm the manager of author and speaker engagement at Pratt. Thanks for coming out today. It's really nice out and you had to make a decision to come inside. So thank you very much. Juana and Martha are going to speak for 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes for your questions. We ask that the questions go to that mic or to that mic. And the reason is the program is hybrid, like 90% of our programs. And that way folks watching back home can hear your question. And you may say, oh, I didn't know that. Well, now you know. And if you can't make it out because the weather's too nice, you can watch the program on our Facebook or YouTube page archive, or you can watch the live stream. So again, 90% of our programs. After the program, we'll bring Martha and Juana back into the green room. We'll let the line form because you're all going to buy books from Grady Reads tonight. And then we'll bring Martha out, she'll sign your book, then you'll go home, and then tomorrow's Tuesday. Thanks for coming out.
Good evening, and welcome to the Pratt Library. I am Vivian Fisher, Deputy Chief of Public Services here at the Pratt Library. And this evening it is my pleasure to introduce Martha Jones and Juana Summers. Martha Jones is a writer, historian, legal scholar, and public intellectual whose work is devoted to understanding the politics, culture, and poetics of Black life. She is a Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute, and Director of Graduate Studies at Johns Hopkins University. A prize-winning author and editor of 4 books, she is past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians and has contributed to the New York Times, Atlantic, and many other publications. Juana Summers is a radio journalist and co-host of NPR's All Things Considered. Summers previously spent more than a decade covering national politics, most recently at NPR's political correspondent, covering race, justice, and politics. Her work has appeared in a variety of publications across multiple platforms, including Politico, CNN, Mashable, and the Associated Press. In 2016, Summers was a fellow at the Georgetown University Institute of Politics and Public Service. Please join me in welcoming Martha Jones, who will discuss her latest work, The Trouble of Color, and Juana Summers to the Pratt Library.
First of all, thank you all so much for having us. I am thrilled to be here with you all and with Martha today to discuss her new book, which I have gotten about last week. Thank you. Honored. I mean, this book, it's really a journey that you undertake. And one of the points that I came when you were young was story, where you have an interaction with classmates, Black sociology class. I wonder by sharing that story with us.
Sure. I have to go back a ways to 1976. I'm afraid there are too many people in this room who don't remember 1976, so I'll remind you. It was the bicentennial of the United States, but that wasn't the most important thing for me. It was my first semester in college. It was my first time away from home, all on my own. I showed up on campus sure that I was going to be a psychology major. That didn't go as planned, but a Black Studies minor, and that did. Black Studies was very exciting in that moment because it was still a very new field. It was being taught by young people who not only had radical intellectual ideas. They also practiced radical politics. And I showed up. I was green, as we say, but I was earnest. And, but it's true that I hadn't really thought through how folks might perceive me, how I might read to people in a literal, physical sense, that I really thought the days of like schoolyard teasing and name calling were behind me, right? I was entering the grown-up world. And I think I was. But I had a classmate, Ron, who, when I stood up on my assigned day to do an assignment, I was doing a report on Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism. I knew too little about Fanon and his work. And Ron interrupted me, interrupted the class, basically to say, you know, who do you think you are? Like, who do you think you are? Standing up and talking about this great Black intellectual, this great Black activist, you know, sit down. And while I did finish the report, it's very important to say, it's also true that he posed a question that has stayed with me here, but I think has also turned out to be a question that's not only defined my life, but as I discovered in this book, it was a question that has really been one that has shaped my family for generations.
There's this idea that you come back to over and over again in the book, and it's about the idea of the color line and the fact that it is not this sort of solid, straight, and narrow line. It is jagged, it is rigid, it can inflict harm. Say more about that concept and your interaction with it.
Sure. I think many folks will know the prophetic words of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. That's one of the very first lessons I learned in Black Studies when I read The Souls of Black Folk in college. But I think that sometimes that metaphor of the line misleads us to think that somehow Black and white Americans have been neatly or definitively living apart, set apart from one another. This isn't really a story of integration, but it is a story about people like the people I come from who never fit neatly on one side of the line or the other. And part of the story I'm able to put together ultimately is one about how in each generation we come up against the color line. Are you this? Are you that? Where do you sit? You know, where do you live? Where do you worship? And I'm able to see that, you know, my feelings were hurt that day in the classroom, but there are wounds that go much deeper than hurt feelings when we live so close to the color line, and I've tried to tell some of those stories.
Let's get into some of the work that you've done in retelling those stories. I mean, what struck me as I was reading this is you're really embarking on this journey to correct the record as it relates to your family's history, to tell a story that is both factually and emotionally true. And in that, you introduce us to so many members of your family. I would like to ask you about one of them, your grandfather, Grandy, who has a proud history at Bennett College that he led for 3 decades. Can you tell us a little bit about him and what you found in your work as it relates to him?
Sure.
Story?
You know, I probably in my head have been writing this book like my whole life. I don't know if you know that feeling. You have a story you're trying to tell, you're trying to pull, but mostly it's in your head. But I decided to try and write it down in a very personal way when I began to discover other historians writing about my family and sometimes not getting it right. And I found my grandfather in an encyclopedia entry. He had led a historically Black college in Greensboro, North Carolina, Bennett College, for near 30 years, from the 1920s to the 1950s. But this encyclopedia entry, when they introduced him, referred to him as a white businessman from Atlanta. Now, my grandfather was never a businessman, but that's not the point. My grandfather White, I knew, of course, that he was the son of a free man of color from central North Carolina, a place called Little Texas. His mother had been born enslaved in eastern North Carolina in Chowan County, that he had been raised in a black enclave there in Greensboro. And yet, I also had to concede, in a way, that the encyclopedia author may not have done as much research as they might have. But probably what they did was look at his photograph. And when they saw his photograph, they landed on a set of assumptions about who he was and what he was, and put that on the page. And that not only stung, right? It helped me to see that there was a connection between the life I was living and the experiences I was having and the life that he had lived. I had never known him. He died just 2 years before I was born, but he was bigger than life in our family lore. And finally, I thought, oh, this is a family story. And now I can go back and see how far back I can go to connect the dots and understand something about what it's like to live with this skin, what it's like to live along that jagged color line.
I mean, you call this a family story. This is so different from so much of your past work. I think we were talking about this backstage, but as a historian, as a journalist, we're taught that part of our currency is to take ourselves out of our work, to have that healthy distance. And in telling a story like this that is literally about your own family, there's no way you can have that kind of distance. You can't take your feelings out of it. You can't take who you are out of it. How did that change the work, the way you approach the storytelling, the way you approached your research?
I had tried, I'll call them false starts. I had tried to write some of the story as you say, as a distant, objective, scholarly writer. And every time I failed, it fell flat. Every time. And so I had to spend time with other kinds of writers, right? I had to spend time with memoirists and novelists and poets to try and, in a sense, retrain myself to write in a way that let me not only put the facts, right, the stories, what I know on the page, but also how it felt for me, in a sense, to recover those stories, and as best I could, how I thought the folks I was writing about felt for themselves. I had a wonderful editor who, every time I would start to write like a historian, which is to say, I'd give a lot of context, I'd draw the scenery, and she'd say, stop that, because when you do that, and I think she was right, you're avoiding the thing that you really want to say. You're moving, to the left and to the right of the heart of the story, and that took time for me to fully embrace as an ethic in the writing. But it's also true that I learned that it was an exhilarating challenge to write without all of the apparatus that a historian uses to, shore up the case. If you doubt what I say in the page, check footnote 17, right? And that will convince you. And I gave
There
up.
are no footnotes.
There
You
are
gave
no
them up.
footnotes. I gave up the footnotes, and I think for me that was exhilarating in a way, because it made me much more attentive to the writing and less preoccupied with the back matter, as we say. And in that, I think for a historian, is a set of lessons about readers and about, as my editor said, nobody wants to read a memoir with footnotes or That's really a turnoff. And I resisted that. But I think I understand much better now what he was driving at. And obviously, folks have to judge for themselves how I did. But for me, it was an exhilarating exercise.
One of the things that was really interesting for me, having read so much of your other work, is that we're getting to go on this journey along with you. So it's not just the lack of adherence to footnotes, but we're actually hearing and feeling your emotional response as you're on this process of discovery. I wonder, was that a challenge for you to be that vulnerable on the page, to share those reactions as you were having?
Yeah, it's true. A lot of what folks will learn is not only what I discovered, but how I discovered it. What it's like to, as I'm sure many people in this room have done, whether it's up late at night on Ancestry.com, right? Combing through the census until your eyes are blurry, or it's winding up at some remote cemetery, walking the grounds, right? Looking for the headstone. It felt important, and I do think it was part of the story, that as I encountered people on those journeys, on those treks, in a sense, they made me part of the story, and because they couldn't regard me as simply a researcher. Once I revealed that I was a descendant, once I revealed that I was looking for my own family, things got pretty messy, I guess. And I realized that was part of the story, is that as a descendant, I stood in a very different place than I have sat or stood when I was writing history.
From reading all of this, it really highlights how challenging it can be to get information about our ancestors, particularly when it comes to the stories of Black women. There's this scene where you're sort of warned off of this journey that you're on to try to get information about the oldest female relative that you know. Her name is Nancy Bell Graves, and she was born back in 1808. And it is striking the lack of effort to preserve the stories and histories and lived experiences that we have as Black women. Can you talk a little bit about the challenges you faced in filling in the gaps of Nancy's story?
Sure. So Nancy Bell Graves, born in 1808 in Danville, Kentucky. She's born enslaved, lives until nearly the end of the 19th century, lives to be a free woman, lives to raise her own children and her grandchildren. And she comes to me first in a photograph. I know almost nothing about her except this gorgeous portrait that she sat for very late in her life. That's me and my husband, Jean, who's here tonight. Thank you, Jean. My research assistant extraordinaire. We trekked to Danville, Kentucky, and we're going to do some sleuthing to see what we can learn about Nancy's life. And we visit a local public library where I think a very well-intentioned librarian, I think that she thinks she wants to be helpful. But by the time the visit is winding up, she is warning me gently but deliberately to be careful. That the story I'm after, which is the story of how Nancy fit into the clan of the White Bell family, the family that had called her property, this librarian lets me know is the kind of story that will unsettle some folks in Danville, and I need to be careful. I think she believed that she was looking out for me, right? I was a stranger. I'm from the north. I've landed from, who knows where. I don't know where I am. I've never been to Kentucky before. I don't have any living relatives that I know of there. So it's just us. My husband is a French guy. We're really we really stand out. And so I think in some ways she's looking out for me, right? But at the same time, she's looking out for the patrimony of Danville. And she's looking out for the stories that people have told and retold over generations. And there's about to be a mashup between what I think I might know about Nancy and the Bell family and the stories that are told on historical markers and in local histories about the same clan. The two don't really fit together.
And what is it that what did you learn about her in undergoing that process? And obviously the warning that you got that wasn't quite heeded. What did you discover?
Well, I'm fortunate in a sort of twisted way, because the last person to call Nancy property, the last man to call her a slave, preserved his papers and deposited them at a local college. I resisted those papers for a long time. I did not want to tell her story through the papers and the records of an enslaver. But it was also true that the record was so slim. It took me a long time, but I finally sat down to look through those papers. And when I do, again, despite having been warned off by an archivist who said there was nothing there about Nancy, I get to the last box. Anybody who's done research knows this. You get to the last box and the last thing and the last box, and you're not sure if you're related because you can like go and have lunch now, or you're disappointed because perhaps you're going to net nothing. But in the last box were the ledger books of a man named Ormond Beatty, who had inherited Nancy and her family from his wife. He was a president of the local college, hence his papers were carefully preserved. And there, after the Civil War, he recorded every transaction with Nancy and her family, every dollar they earned, every cent they borrowed, every favor he did in his view for them, in meticulous detail. They're very cold records, right, callous records, not intended to tell us how people felt or what they meant to one another. But they did allow me not only to piece together an important chapter in Nancy's life, the beginning of her life as a free person. In those pages, I discovered her sisters. And I'd never known about Betty or Tina. They weren't part of our family lore. Their photos were not among the photos that I had inherited. But there they were on the pages of Beatty's ledger. Betty becomes ill in 1867. Beatty forks over the money for her burial, or loans the money for her burial, really. And in the end, there's a little bit left in her account, and he splits it up between Tina and Nancy, her sisters. And now I see Nancy in a whole new light, because I understand that she had people with her, right, on this extraordinary and arduous journey from slavery to freedom, and they were her true kin, we might say, her sisters.
You know, it strikes me, given the time period that we're talking about in doing all of this unearthing and all of the learning that you're doing, there's a lot of pain and painful memories that come along with that. And I just wonder, as you were going through all this, how did you care for yourself when you're taking in all of this painful history, learning about brutality and injustices that were done upon people that are your kin, that are your family? How did you care for you?
You know, this is me, you know, on one hand, telling stories on myself in this book, which is to say, you know, you'd think a historian, when she comes upon a rich and revealing document, would dive in. But there are some pieces of this story that I discovered, and I put them away for a decade. Right? So partly, I'm giving myself a kind of grace, not only to sit with what I learned, but to read more and to understand better the worlds from which they came. I read again and again the memoir penned in 1861 by Harriet Jacobs, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And Jacobs is a guide for so many of us in entering that world, with her frankness, but also her insight and her wisdom. So I spend time with writers like this who help me. And on the other hand, I'll say that I felt emboldened by Nancy, by my great-great-grandmother Isabella, who bore 9 children by the man who called her a slave. Because I thought, if they could survive, right, they could survive, live to raise their families, and make me possible, I could be courageous enough to write those stories down, right, to honor those stories. And in that way, I think there was for me, always a kind of curious joy about being with them, right? That's part of what we do and we get to do when we do our family history, is that we get to commune with people we may have known for a time. Many of them we never knew in the earthly sense, but I got to spend time with them, and I loved spending time with them and understanding them better and testing out my ideas with them and understanding them better than I had. And so I don't know if that sounds strange, but I think even in the difficult parts, I felt like I was honoring them, and I felt like it was an extraordinary joy to be with them finally in a full or a fuller way, I guess.
At so many different points in your book, there's the official record, there's what the facts say, and then there's what your ancestors have said. And those two things, they don't always line up. And you talk very openly about what it is to decide to listen to the women, to decide to listen to your family and what they are telling you about their own truth. But I have to imagine, as somebody who has spent so many years as a historian, it is daunting to say, maybe the facts and figures aren't the full story here. Talk about that a bit.
Absolutely. We've talked about Nancy. On the back of that photograph that I had, my father's sister, my Aunt Tuppy, had made a very brief note. Nancy Graves lived in Danville, had 7 girls and 7 boys. Okay. Well, I spent years going through census returns and wills and death certificates, church records, Ormond Beatty's papers. I never could find more than 4 girls. And I think you're right that for a while, I built this family tree online, you know, and I had the 4 girls because that's what the official record said. That's all I could discover there. And then I discovered not only had my aunt written down the 7 girls, but my great-grandmother had been interviewed about Nancy, and she had also said she had 7 girls. So now, what to do, right? What to do? Where do you land? And it was a turning point for me because I realized that, in a way, the census, death certificates, birth certificates, in their own ways, those are just stories, right? They're written by men. They're mostly men, right, in this period. They're written for the purposes of maintaining bureaucracies and counting people. They're not written to capture family stories, but that the women who had known Nancy and the women who had inherited her stories told another story. And it's then that I go back to my tree and I enter the 3, for me, unknown girls. Because, in fact, the official record, the so-called official record, is just storytelling too. And in this book, I was going to honor the stories that were told as far as I could take them by the stories from my own family. I was going to honor those as sometimes as far-fetched as they were, as fantastical as they sounded, right? As much as I couldn't find, the paper trail, I was going to honor those stories. And that is, I think, part of, the way we might think about family history and the kinds of commitments we make when we do family history, right? Is who are we writing for, right? Who are we writing to? What is the purpose of what we do? And my purpose couldn't be to mimic the census return. My goodness, the census taker had nothing but probably nefarious interests in the people in Nancy's family. But there were other people whose stories I really could honor and put on the page.
There's also the role here of imagination. None of the records that you were sifting through, none of the things that you were learning, they can't tell you what it was like when your relatives were married. They can't tell you what it was like to sit around a table and to share a meal with them. So at points in the book, you fill in the gaps. You imagine what it might have been like for them, how they might have lived, what would have been like if they had shared their own stories. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. This comes late in the writing, but there are gaps. Right? That's history too. And academic historians, when I'm wearing that hat, we like to, paper over the gaps and smooth out the story. That's how we work oftentimes. Give you the illusion, right, that there is sort of a seamless narrative to be discovered. But in fact, and it is especially true when we're in the early chapters and we are trying to recover the stories of formerly enslaved people, that there's a great deal we can't know. And you're right, I let myself imagine. I have a great-grandmother who often told a story about herself, and it went something like, she was the granddaughter of John Jacob Astor. Now, if that name doesn't ring a bell, I'll remind you, John Jacob Astor was the richest man in 19th century America. He was a fur dealer and later a real estate magnate in New York City. In my family, we too often, I think, regarded that as flight of fancy, as a kind of joke. But back to the honoring the stories, I thought, what would happen if I took Jenny's story seriously about John Jacob Astor? And I do some imagining, I do some sleuthing in the archives, and again, I have to leave it to you to decide how I do. But again and again, I think putting on the page not only my imagination, but the things I dream for them, the things I wish for them, the things I hope for when I don't know them, is a very different way of telling the story. But I think that to not tell you that is not to tell you a kind of truth, right, about what it's like to reconstruct their lives, which is that I'm brimming, right, with hopes and dreams and imaginations and possibilities for them in all those places where I can't quite fill the gap.
I want to jump forward in your family's history a bit because there's another person that you introduced us to in your family that I was sort of captivated by, and that is the person that you call the bishop, your grandfather's brother. Can you talk a little bit about him and tell us, I guess I'm interested in what you knew about him and his stories before you set out to do this work, and then what you learned.
Yeah. So Robert Jones was my grandfather's older brother by like 16 or 18 years, and he really was became like a father to my grandfather, and helped to raise him. But the bishop is not just a familiar name. He grows up to be a bishop in the Methodist Episcopal Church, based in New Orleans and later in Columbus and Ohio. And he is the patriarch. And I grew up not knowing him, but knowing of him and having a very high regard for him. He, late in his life, told his life story and his family story, our family story, to a historian. in a book called The Negro Vanguard. I can't quite recommend it, but unless you want to see a very curious artifact of the 1960s. But in it, I had read that book many, many times because the bishop tells a series of stories about who he comes from and where we come from. And yet, as I begin to probe, I realize very clearly he has told, a carefully crafted version of family story. Right? He has told some things, he's left other things out. In particular, he has left out what for me is an essential piece of the story, which is that we come from enslaved people and not free Black people. So again, what to do? Because I don't think for me I wasn't interested in a game of gotcha. I wasn't even interested in correcting him or setting the record straight. He taught me, that family history, family stories shift in every generation. We tell, in a sense, we tell the stories we need to tell. We tell the stories of our time. So I sit today, and for me to tell the stories of my enslaved foremothers is something I do with pride. Their capacity to survive, right? Their resilience, their persistence, their courage. We tell those stories today with our chests full because we come from extraordinary people, extraordinary women. My great uncle the bishop came from those same women, but I think he told the story in a time where he wasn't sure. He told the story, I don't know, this will land for some people. He told the story before Roots. You remember Roots? So it's 1976, 1977. So he's telling the story before that moment in which, a book and then a television miniseries emboldens a lot of us, right, to embrace the fullness of a family past, even its darkest and most desperate chapters, to understand that that's our story, but it's a national story. We're transformed, I think, a lot of us in that moment. He doesn't live until that moment, and he doesn't enjoy the benefit, if you will, of being part of a collective transformation that I was there to benefit from. So appreciating that there's truth in the story he told, kind of the truth of the facts, but also a truth about the time he lived in and the man he was and the way he wanted to represent his family in the world. And it's not any more or less true, I think, in that emotional sense, right, than the story I've told. And I love that, in a sense, we are in a dialogue. And if I could talk to him, as I do sometimes, but as another story. But I would just say to him, it really does change, right? And the way in which we can, whether it's finding those stories in the archives or telling difficult truths about what we find in the archives, that I've lived long enough to be able to tell those in another kind of way. And that is a tribute, right, to all of us who have been committed to the Black past, to all of us who have surfaced those stories, who honored those stories, who read those stories, who write those stories. And he just didn't have that context.
Different context. What did you learn about your parents and their place in your family's history that you did not know before embarking on this really years-long journey of discovery?
So I think that the story, for a long time, I told myself about why I look the way I do, how a Black girl could look so white was that I came from a so-called interracial marriage. My mother was the child of German and Irish immigrants. My father's family, you've heard a lot about. And that was as much as I knew, in a way, and that was the story I think I told myself for a long time. And I was born in the 50s. My parents are married in 1957. Their marriage, as many of you know, is still illegal in 17 or 18 states, including his home state of North Carolina. And they are outlaws in many ways, and they are certainly pariahs, kind of socially, where we are in Harlem and then in the suburbs of New York City. I think they are the key for a long time. And then I dive in to discover the story of my great-great-grandparents, Mary and Elijah Jones, who were married in 1827. So that is 130 years before my parents. Mary is a so-called white woman, and Elijah is a man of color. It's illegal to marry for them in North Carolina. It has been since 1750 in North Carolina. And they trick the eyes of the court clerk. Later, they'll trick the eyes of the census taker. And Mary, in their time, will become a woman of color. In order for them to wed, in order for them to make a family, in order for them to have a home and live a long life together, she will give up being a white woman and that identity and that family that she had come from in order to be part of Elijah's world. Wow. It turns out that my parents were not the first at all, despite what family members said, that my parents were, I don't know, tradition is probably an exaggeration, but they weren't the first to transgress in that way. And that's one of the keys, right, to the story of who I am.
What was that discovery like for you? That is taking a fundamental truth that you thought you knew about your family, completely flipping it on its head.
You know, you all remember Rachel Dolezal? If you don't, just ignore what I'm going to say. But if you do, I think Mary frightened me at first, because I thought, what is this white woman doing passing for a black woman? We don't really countenance that. And Rachel, is, the poster child for why we don't do that and why we don't countenance that. But again, 1827 is not 2007 or 2017, whenever the Dolezal story breaks. And I have to work up the courage, and I have to hope that you might read Mary's story and have a corner of understanding for her and for Elijah and for their children, enough to let her be in this story who she was, complicated, but important.
We've got a couple of minutes left before we kick over questions to the audience, so I'll ask you one or two more questions. You write towards the end of this book that you waited until loved ones from your parents' generation had passed on to put pen to paper to record a lot of these stories. Talk about why.
I think it's like a lot of the raw material in this book. I had to sit with it. And I think when I started the book, I wasn't sure I would write about my own parents at all, even though they had passed now quite a few years ago. I thought it still might be too raw. It still might be too sensitive, not only for me, I have siblings, too sensitive for them, too tender is what I mean, right? Too tender. But in this sense, writing is a healing thing. It can be a healing thing for us. The stories that we craft, stories that we tell, and the parts about my own parents are the sections I wrote again and again. My editor at one point said to me, you have to stop writing like a petulant child, which is to say I had grievances and, I had feelings, right? Why wouldn't you? But writing is a healing process. It can be, and particularly writing in memoir. And so I wrote and I wrote and I wrote again until I thought I landed somewhere where I was comfortable and where I hoped that they would be comfortable too. But kudos to people who write about their parents while their parents are still there to critique and edit and weigh in. That kind of courage I do not have. I do not have.
I'll end with this question. I mean, this is a remarkable work. I've learned so much about you and your family and the people that you came from, but I wonder, in going through this process and going through this work, what did you learn about yourself, and did anything that you learned cause you to think differently about the legacy of your family?
The most unexpected thing for me in this book, in the process of writing, is that I discovered a sense of humor. I mostly, if anybody knows me, I mostly live my life, by way of pathos. It's really just all pathos. And all of a sudden, it's the humor in the face of absurdity, right? Race in America is an absurdity. It is a powerful, right, a pernicious absurdity. Is it a set of lies, as my friend Jelani Cobb has said, right? Lie upon lie. But a lie that wounds us, right? That threatens us. And I lived, as I think a lot of us do, right? Very cognizant of the ways in which I lived under the threat of race and racism, of course. So I'm going to tell you a 2-second story, because I know we're going to questions. So a couple of weeks ago, we went on holiday and I did a talk in Montgomery, in Alabama. And we went to Brian Stevenson's Legacy Museum. And there's a restaurant there, which I highly recommend, Southern food. It's Panny and George. And I'm in line for Panny and George, and there are 2 young women behind us. One who appears to be a young black woman, a young white woman. And they're sort of, they're doing what you do while you're waiting in line. And then I realized they want to ask me a question. Can we ask you a question? And I said, sure. And they said, we want to ask you about your skin. Now, in my lifetime, that is all the warning bells go off, right? Here we go again, right? But it turns out what they are seeing is a woman of a certain age whose skin, as they say, still glows. They don't want to know about race. They don't want to know about color. They don't want to know about the trouble of color. They want to know about my retinol, right? And my sunscreen. And I love that. They taught me so much about where I have arrived at in a lifetime. But it was a real gift, right? Because it's another generation, and it's another set of questions, and apparently it has everything to do with the wrinkles or the absence of wrinkles, and not the presence or the absence of melanin. So there you have it.
We'll turn it over to questions now. Hopefully you'll drop the skincare regimen somewhere. So I can take some notes.
So we have about 15
I
minutes.
should get an endorsement deal from Kiehl's or something.
We have 15 minutes for your questions. Again, if you could line up at that microphone or this microphone. Let's start on this side, and we'll ping pong back and forth.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
I wonder if there's a connection that you would like to make or not, between the great work you've been doing here at Hopkins these last few years on hard histories and uncovering the idea that Johns Hopkins may have owned enslaved people and the various parts of this institution that we all live with are deeply embedded in slavery. And is that connection between that and this memoir, and would you like to talk about that at all?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. And I direct a project called Hard Histories at Hopkins that indeed has looked at many aspects of Mr. Hopkins' life, including the enslaved people who lived in his household, according to the census taker in 1840 and 1850. You know, in doing that work for a long time, I think I felt like a historian, and, you know, a little bit like an interloper. I'm not a Baltimorean. I'm pretty new to Hopkins. However, when I realized that part of my own family story is about a college president owning members of my family, is about their descendant, my grandmother, who marries a college president, I begin to think that there's an element of fate that brought me here and brought me to the important work of Hard Histories. I'm going to acknowledge my colleagues from Hopkins Retrospective who are here, who have been important partners in that work. But I think, in fact, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be in that work, whether you agree with me or disagree with me about the conclusions I draw. That has really helped me to establish my firm footing in that work. So thank you so much for the question. Hi, good evening.
Hi, good evening. My question is, being a psychology graduate from Virginia State University, I was interested in how you started out saying that you were a psychology student and you swayed away, and I'm wondering what happened there.
I can't tell if you're glad or
just interested, just interested.
Well, I'll say I stayed a psychology major, and I had a roommate who was also a psychology major, and seeing her, her commitment to hands-on research, her capacity with, you know, the very intimate inner lives of people, troubled people, let me know that I was not cut out. So I went
You got to be built for it. You got to be
Thank
built
you.
for it.
I went to law school instead, which is its own kind of helping profession, if I might try and defend myself. But very grateful, because it was really psychology and working in the psychology labs that taught me I could be a researcher, because I could spend hour upon hour alone in the lab late at night, and I still do that without the rats and the electric fish.
I did that. I did that.
You know exactly what I'm talking about. Thank you so much for the question.
Thank you.
Sure.
Good evening.
Good evening.
I've enjoyed your presentation, and I see parallels in a lot of what you say and what I've learned about my own family. I'm from the North, and I did the Ancestry.com thing, and there's a lot of people, mainly women in my family, that look Caucasian, and the men look more like me. But when I did that ancestry thing, and I found out that half of my ancestry was African and the other half was European, it opened a window that I had never looked through before. And so I went to the South and I started researching it, and I started finding all these white cousins and relatives, some of whom embrace me, and some of the most famous ones don't want anything to do with me. But I decided to write a manuscript about it. And that's what attracted me to your book and this program tonight. And I'm almost done with it, but to write a story of the white family and the black family is something that I think challenges a lot of people, especially in the South. And in trying to find a book agent to help me carry this forward, I've had some difficulty. You know, there was one that told me, well, you're writing a black book. No, I'm not writing a black book. I'm writing an American book. And what advice would you give to someone like me that's searching for people that can help me get this story out, that aren't going to look at it as just a black story, but instead as an American story?
Yeah. I can tell you, first of all, hats off to you for doing the DNA research, because I have not done DNA research. That's extraordinarily, there's a vulnerability in that is very specific. And I can tell you what mattered to me. I spent a good amount of time in writing workshops. The Hurston Wright Center, for example, does online workshops for writers. I spent more time with writers and became more a part of that network. It helped with my writing and improving my writing, but really it put me in a world of other writers and folks who were writing, not history, because I have that kind of company in my colleagues, but I didn't have company of memoirists and family storytellers. So, you know, here in Maryland, the Writers Center in, is it in Montgomery? I'm not going to remember. Is that right? Thank you. There are so many opportunities, some of them online, some of them in person, but become a part of that world, and you will meet people who have been on your journey, who are embarking on that journey, and they were extraordinarily helpful to me. And I wish you all the best with it, because I think that you're telling a truth, you know, as I understand it, which is that, you know, in some generations, who we call kin are these folks on the tree. In the next generation, it's sort of these folks on the tree. I don't know, maybe you're going to tell us a story that really sort of embraces the whole of the tree. And I think that's really beautiful. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have time for 3 more questions. We'll take 2 over here and 1 here.
Great. Hi.
Hi, Martha. Thank you for writing this book. It was wonderful. And thank you for not putting the footnotes in. And I have a question about your dad. The stories are just wonderful, but the story about your dad just feels like it's not done. And I was wondering if you have a sense of still question about your dad, if you could have one more conversation with your dad about race, what would it be like?
Thank you so much for that, and thank you for lifting up my father, who is the subject of the last chapter, and in a way is the most mysterious figure of all. And isn't that strange, right? Because of course he's someone I knew for you know, nearly all of my life. I think that for my father, if we were going to have one more conversation, I think it really would be about where he landed. And I think where he landed was in his own way, in a world and in a life in which he left the trouble of color behind as best he could. And I think as a younger person, I experienced that as a betrayal. And in a kind of abandonment. But I think that at least in the book, I'm trying to approach some understanding of that. You know, he was a troubled person. There were things I couldn't know about him. You know, for example, my father was hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital as a young man, and the Navy destroyed those records routinely, not in a sinister way. And so there are things I'm not able to know, and I'm not able to tell you. But I think I'd really want to know, you know, how he felt about where he landed in the end, and if that had been the right choice for him. I suspect it was. Thank you for that so much. Hi.
Hello. My name is Blair. I'm a student at Morgan State University, here with some of my other classmates.
Hey, Morgan.
Yeah, and first of all, thank you for coming and just sharing your story with us today. I really enjoyed it. So my question is, I guess, based on your family's history and then your own personal experiences, how has racial identity evolved in America, like just based on your perception, and how has society and its changes shaped your understanding of that?
Yeah. Thank you again so much for that. Thank you all for coming out. You know, I'm careful here, right, because a family story can't substitute for good sociological or historical work, right, that looks at the big picture. But I think it does, in a way, give us a way to think critically about some of that work. I write about, I think, a somewhat notorious. So are any of you students of Daryl Michael Scott? No, at Morgan.
I've met him.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So he was my professor back in the day, and he taught a book by E. Franklin Frazier called Black Bourgeoisie. And let me tell you, I cracked open Black Bourgeoisie, and I was mortified because I saw my grandparents and their generation being pilloried on the pages of Frazier's book. That's how I felt initially. But when I came back to really think about it in a concerted way, I just thought Frazier didn't get it all right? He knew my grandparents. He shared a great deal with them politically and professionally. He had been in their home. And I knew that while Frazier had his ideas about, you know, folks from the talented 10th and light-skinned folks and about their pretensions and their aspirations and more, I knew he had gotten my grandparents wrong, right? I can't say, as a sociologist, right, where the balance of it all is, but he got my grandparents wrong, and that, I think, is a useful place for family history in the bigger stories we tell about race in America. Yeah, thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Take our last question over here.
yeah, hi. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for very thought-provoking discussions. I appreciate that. A book that has caused me some thought recently, and I'm curious to ask, is The Color of Water by James McBride. And I'm curious, and that was written in the 90s. And I'm curious, has there been an increased exploration in sort of mixed race family history? Of course, this is a very different perspective. So
Sure.
curious of that.
I mean, to me, James McBride's The Color of Water is, opens the door, right? You know, sort of sets the table for now really a whole generation of folks who are from families that don't comport with the boxes and the categories and more. I got to meet McBride at the National Book Festival in Washington last summer, and I nervously sat with him, you know, like at his knees saying, thank you, because he did, you know, give us the authorization to write about complicated family stories, to write about color, to remind us that the American family is not a monolith or is not neatly organized along the color line, as we call it. But it is also true that novelists have been some of my best companions. And while that's a memoir, right, McBride is largely a novelist, you know, that fiction writers like Danzy Senna and Matt Johnson and others have been real beacons for somebody like me, not only because they write so insightfully about race and color and identity, because they have a sense of humor, and not just pathos. And so, Dan Zesena's recent book, Colored Television, if folks haven't read it, is so marvelous and so wry, so sophisticated, but is in some ways, I think, walking, has, left the footprints for someone like me to come behind. So there is a great tradition, if we could call it that. I know we're ending, but, you could all go all the way back to talk about, the great Iola Leroy from the Baltimorean, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Nella Larson's passing, right? That these are old stories that we've told and retold, many of them in fiction, and in that way, I'm super humbled, right, to be writing in their wake. Thanks for that.
Please help me thank this evening's moderator, Juana Summers. And this evening's author, Martha Jones. Now you will purchase books. It's a directive. And Martha will be out in 5 minutes, and we'll chat some more, and she'll sign some books. Thanks for coming out.